Can a poor waitress change her entire life simply by holding on to her kindness, even when humiliated in front of everyone? Tonight, Eden Hall shimmered like a palace under the glow of crystal chandeliers. Perfectly tailored suits and elegant evening gowns glided past each other across the polished marble floor, the rhythmic clinking of cutlery against fine porcelain creating a symphony of refined luxury. Everything was so immaculate, so flawless, it was almost suffocating because a single mistake could shatter this grand illusion. And then it happened. In the midst of this opulence stood Victor Hale, dressed in a sharp black suit with every fold pressed to perfection, like a commander surveying his battlefield. His eyes were cold, scanning every detail with razor-sharp precision. No one knew that this man was not just a powerful guest, but the true owner of Eden Hall. Every staff member was aware of his presence that evening, but none expected that he would test them himself, and in the harshest way possible. His target had been chosen Lydia Moore, the young waitress who had worked at Eden Hall for less than 3 months. The petite girl stepped toward Victor's table, carefully balancing a tray of wine, every finger stiff with tension. Her white uniform had been pressed neatly, but the faint fraying at the cuffs betrayed its age. Lydia's eyes lowered, avoiding Victor's gaze as a chill radiated from him. She gently placed the wine glass on the table, but after a mere moment of hesitation, Victor took the glass of deep red wine, examined it in his hand as though judging a work of art, and suddenly, without warning, flung it directly at her. The crimson liquid splashed across her pristine white blouse, leaving a glaring stain that seemed impossible to erase. A quiet gasp escaped from a few guests, but it was quickly stifled as though no one dared to interfere. Victor looked up, his deep, icy voice carrying across the hall for all to hear. "Someone like you belongs in a dingy alley diner, not here." His words cut into Lydia's fragile pride like a blade. She stood frozen, her body trembling slightly, her head bowed. Her hands gripped the silver tray so tightly her knuckles turned white, her heart pounding wildly as if it might burst from her chest. Around her, the noise seemed to vanish, leaving only the weight of the judging stares from the wealthy patrons, eyes that looked at her as if she were beneath them. A guest nearby shifted as if to speak, but quickly turned away, fear of being involved forcing everyone into silence. Not a single person came to Lydia's defense. Even Gareth Cole, her manager standing only a few steps away, merely glanced over before deliberately looking elsewhere, pretending not to notice. Eden Hall continued its elegant facade, as though this humiliation was just another part of its sophisticated evening. Lydia lowered her head further, biting her lip to hold back a sob. She couldn't react, couldn't shed a single tear, because one drop falling onto the cold marble floor could cost her the job, the only thing keeping her and her son from being swallowed by the harsh realities of life outside. Victor stood unmoved, his expression unchanging, the corners of his mouth lifting in a faint, unreadable smile. To him, this was not just a cruel game. This was a test, a way to see who truly deserved to survive in the unforgiving world he had built. The next morning, pale sunlight slipped through the torn curtains of a small, worn-out apartment. Lydia Moore knelt down, her thin hands swiftly tying the shoelaces of her son, Eli, a 5-year-old boy with clear brown eyes. "I'll be home early tonight, sweetheart," Lydia said, trying to make her voice sound cheerful, but the slight trembling at the corners of her lips betrayed the worry swelling inside her. Eli looked up at his mother, his eyes full of innocent hope, and smiled, nodding gently. He didn't notice that his mother's uniform was frayed or that her slender fingers trembled with exhaustion. Lydia stood, smoothing Eli's hair, subtly pulling down her sleeve to hide the yellowed stain at her cuff. The refrigerator in the corner hummed faintly, its half-open door revealing only half a bottle of milk and a shriveled apple. Lydia glanced at it, her heart sinking, but she crouched down and whispered to Eli, "Things will get better. I promise." The promise was as fragile as her voice, but Eli didn't notice, his small hand gripping hers with unshaken trust. The road to the bus stop was damp after last night's rain, puddles reflecting the gray sky. A car sped past, splashing dirty water onto the hem of Lydia's skirt, chilling her thin legs. She only shivered slightly, not stopping to wipe it away, and held Eli's small hand tighter. Among the busy crowd, Lydia stood out not for her appearance but for the quiet determination in her frail figure. As they waited at a crosswalk, two elegantly dressed women walked past, glancing at Lydia before whispering to each other in a voice just loud enough for her to hear. How long can she even cling to that job at Eden Hall? She doesn't look like someone who will last there. Every word struck Lydia like a needle, but she kept her face calm. She didn't turn her head, didn't respond, only tightened her grip on Eli's hand. The boy looked up at her, oblivious to the meaning of those words, smiling innocently as he asked, "Will you tell me a new story tonight, Mommy?" Lydia nodded softly, forcing a weak smile. She didn't dare let him see that her eyes were already glistening with tears. Inside, she repeated to herself once more like a fragile mantra, "Just a little longer, things will get better." But deep down, she knew that in this cold, unfeeling world, such a promise was nothing more than a faint light, one that could be snuffed out at any moment. The old bus rattled along the pothole-ridden road, each jolt sending Lydia Moore's body swaying gently. She sat pressed against the cold glass window, her head leaning against it, eyes half closed, her eyelashes trembling faintly. She had barely slept the night before, spending hours stitching up the torn seam on the side of her uniform, each prick of the needle leaving her fingertips red and swollen, but she kept going because she couldn't afford a new one. Her stomach was empty, sustained only by a thin cup of tea from the previous night, yet Lydia sat perfectly still, never uttering a word of complaint. Voices murmured around the bus, scattered and broken like static from a bad radio signal. Most of it faded into a dull blur until one sentence cut through, sharp and clear, stabbing at her chest. "That's the girl who got wine thrown on her last night, isn't it? I heard the owner of Eden Hall hates new staff who don't know their place." A man's hushed whisper to the person beside him, just loud enough for Lydia to hear. A soft chuckle followed. "She won't last long, you could tell by the way she froze up yesterday." Lydia didn't turn her head, didn't react, but her heart pounded violently as if it might burst. Her fingers tightened around the worn strap of her bag until her knuckles turned white, the bag trembling slightly on her lap with each bump of the bus. In that moment, she wanted to disappear, to step off and run away from the stares, from the cruel, whispered judgments. But then Eli's image flashed in her mind, his innocent smile and that hopeful question. "You'll tell me a new story tonight, won't you, Mommy?" Lydia inhaled deeply, swallowing every ounce of anger and humiliation, whispering to herself so quietly no one else could hear, "Just keep going for Eli." Her eyes opened, staring out through the dusty glass window. Outside, cars sped past. People rushed by, no one caring about the young woman clinging desperately to the last shred of hope she had. But in Lydia's gaze, a fragile flicker of determination sparked to life, like a tiny candle refusing to be snuffed out. She told herself again, if she could hold on for just one more day, everything wouldn't fall apart. Across the aisle, a younger girl glanced at Lydia. Seeing her sitting upright, not a single tear falling, that girl's expression shifted briefly to one of quiet admiration, though she didn't say a word. Lydia didn't notice. She simply sat there, her hands still gripping the old bag, her heart racing, each beat repeating the same reminder over and over: Eli needs her, and she cannot break. As Lydia stepped into Eden Hall, the familiar scent of expensive perfume and the warm golden light wrapped around her, but there was no sense of peace. The moment she crossed the glass doors, a voice sliced through the air. "You're late again, aren't you, Lydia?" Gareth Cole, her manager, stood with arms crossed at the bar, his narrow eyes filled with irritation. Lydia lowered her head, her hands instinctively gripping the edge of her apron, about to explain, but Gareth waved dismissively, cutting her off. "Don't make excuses. There's no place here for people who drag their feet. If we weren't short on staff, do you think you'd still be standing here?" His sharp words rang loud enough for several nearby employees to hear, and they exchanged smug glances. One of them whispered to another, "She's probably just hired to fill numbers." The reply was a quiet, derisive laugh. Lydia tightened her grip on her apron straps, pressing her lips together to stay calm. She couldn't let herself react or lose control because one mistake could cost her the job. She lowered her head, slipping toward the prep area, hoping the night would pass quietly. But that night had no room for quiet. Victor Hale arrived. He entered like a commander stepping onto a battlefield, his tall figure and flawless black suit casting a heavy silence over Eden Hall's grand hall. The other staff immediately straightened their backs, avoiding his gaze as if simply meeting his eyes could be dangerous. Victor stopped in the center of the hall, his cold eyes sweeping across every corner. When they landed on Lydia, the corner of his lips curved into a thin line, a look caught between amusement and contempt. "You come here," Victor said, his voice carrying clearly enough for every diner to hear. Lydia's heart pounded as she took slow, hesitant steps toward his table. The tension was so thick that some guests stopped eating, silently watching. Victor looked her up and down, his gaze judging her as if she were a substandard item. His voice dropped, deep and sharp enough to send a chill through the room. How disappointing. Has Eden Hall lowered its standards to this level? Lydia didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the floor, but Victor wasn't finished. He lifted a glass of water, rolling it in his hand before suddenly tipping it, letting the water spill across the polished marble floor. "Clean it," he ordered, his tone delivering the command like a sentence. Lydia hesitated for a brief second, then knelt, pulling a small cloth from her apron. Her hands trembled as they touched the cold puddle, each drop soaking through the fabric, dampening her calloused fingers. The hall was silent, the only sound the faint rubbing of the cloth against the marble. Victor sat back in his chair, relaxed, his cold gray eyes watching her. "Right where you belong on the floor," he said, almost in a whisper, but every word was heard clearly. A woman sitting nearby bit her lip, pity flashing briefly in her eyes, but when Victor's gaze swept past her, she quickly turned away, fear overpowering compassion. Lydia kept her breathing steady, her hands moving even after the floor had already dried. She didn't dare lift her head, didn't dare let anyone see the heat in her eyes, the anger and humiliation burning inside. But in her chest, her heart pounded fiercely, every beat echoing the same reminder Eli needs her. And she had to endure. The restroom at Eden Hall was eerily quiet, the only sound the steady drip of water from the sink. Lydia Moore stood in front of the large mirror, her eyes red and swollen, her hair messy after an evening of relentless tension. She touched the cold surface of the mirror, her fingers trembling slightly. In the reflection, she saw a frail woman, shoulders slumped as if they might break at any moment. Lydia closed her eyes, whispering softly as if in prayer, "Eli needs me, I have to stand strong." Just one night of collapse, and everything she was holding on to would crumble. She splashed her face with cold water, letting it wash away the fatigue clinging to her skin, then drew in a deep breath, forcing her breathing to steady. In the mirror, her eyes held a faint spark of determination, fragile, yet enough to push her back out into the hall. When she returned to the main dining area, the atmosphere was still heavy. Victor Hale sat at his usual table, calm, composed, as though he were simply enjoying an ordinary evening. But the moment Lydia appeared, his cold gray eyes locked onto her. A faint, unreadable smile curved his lips as he placed a fresh glass of wine on the table. His deep, steady voice carried clearly, "You, come here." Lydia took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm, and stepped forward, each step feeling like she was walking across thin ice. Victor tilted his head, his gaze slow and deliberate, as if peeling back every layer she tried to hide. His voice was calm, but carried a hint of challenge. "Bring me another bottle of wine. And don't make a mistake this time." Lydia bowed her head slightly and turned to leave, but her steps faltered, as if something unseen held her in place. 1 second passed, then 2. Finally she turned back, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice, though soft, came out clear. Would you like me to call the manager for you, sir?" The entire hall fell silent. The sound of cutlery clinking against plates vanished. Every pair of eyes turned to Lydia, not to help her, but because no one could believe a staff member had dared to speak to Victor that way. Gareth Cole, standing near the bar, stiffened, his eyes flashing with irritation and barely concealed hostility. His jaw tightened, his lips pressed into a thin line, as if mentally recording every detail to use against Lydia later. Victor sat still, his eyes fixed on her. For a moment, time seemed to stop. His gray gaze bored into her, not with anger, not with a smile, only with a deep, unreadable scrutiny. Then suddenly, the corner of Victor's lips curved into a thin, mocking smile. He didn't respond. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, lifted his glass of wine, and took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving Lydia. The hall remained silent. Lydia bowed her head deeply, her hands hidden beneath her apron, gripping so tightly that her nails pressed into her skin. Her heart pounded wildly, as if it might burst, but she didn't let herself run. She stood there, waiting, like a soldier awaiting judgment. Victor said nothing, simply set his glass back on the table, spun it lightly between his fingers, then glanced away, signaling her to continue her work. She walked off, her heart still trembling, but inside, a strange, unfamiliar feeling flickered to life for the first time. She had not completely surrendered. That night, Eden Hall had grown quiet, with only a few remaining guests dining in silence under the warm golden lights. Lydia Moore moved among the tables like a shadow. Every step felt heavy, yet she kept a polite smile on her face. Her hands trembled slightly from exhaustion, her fingers swollen and red after hours of carrying heavy trays, but she refused to let herself stop. Patiently, she wiped each table, straightening every tablecloth as if it were the most important thing in her life. Soft laughter drifted from the service counter. 2 other staff members glanced at Lydia, exchanging mocking looks. "She's insane, staying after hours just to scrub tables." "Who does she think she is?" one whispered, loud enough for Lydia to hear. She heard every word, but she didn't respond, didn't even look up. She simply bent lower, wiping the tablecloth until not a single fold was out of place. In a shadowed corner near the stairs, Victor Hale stood watching. The light from the hall cast half his face into darkness, leaving only his sharp gray eyes visible, gleaming with their usual cold intensity. But tonight, there was something different in that gaze. He didn't call Lydia, didn't give her an order. He simply observed, quietly studying every small, deliberate movement she made. Gareth Cole passed by, catching sight of Victor, and quickly approached, lowering his voice. "What a waste of time, isn't it? She doesn't have a future here. If you approve, I'll write the termination request tomorrow." Victor didn't answer immediately. He turned his head slowly toward Gareth, his eyes flashing with a cold glint. Then he spoke in a low, steady voice. "Not yet." Gareth stiffened, confused, but didn't dare ask further. He stepped back, leaving Victor standing silently in the darkened corner, his gaze never leaving Lydia. Lydia had no idea she was being watched. She knelt to pick up a napkin that had fallen under a table. As she bent down, her black hair fell across half her face, revealing only tired eyes that, despite everything, hadn't lost their light. In those eyes was something Victor couldn't look away from, a strange, quiet resilience. The wall clock ticked slowly, marking the passing of time long after her shift had ended. Still, Lydia hadn't left. She gathered the tablecloths, adjusted every chair as if preparing for an important guest who might sit there tomorrow. When she finally finished, she let out a quiet breath, smiling wearily, and turned toward the door. Victor watched her, his eyes darkening, the corner of his mouth curling into an unreadable expression. He no longer saw just an ordinary waitress. What he saw felt familiar, a quiet strength that not everyone possessed. The next morning, pale sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows of Eden Hall, glinting off the polished marble floor like sheets of gold. The luxurious hall felt different somehow. Staff moved quickly, not because of an unusual rush of customers, but because of an order issued early that morning. Victor Hale wanted to meet with every employee today. Lydia Moore stood near the counter, her hands busy folding napkins. Her heart pounded uncontrollably, each beat like a war drum echoing in her chest. Rumors had spread like wildfire all morning. "She's definitely getting fired," one staff member whispered, shooting Lydia a smug glance. Another added, "Who stands up to Victor and still keeps their job?" Every word felt like a needle piercing her ears, but Lydia didn't respond. She stayed silent, gripping the edges of the napkin so tightly that her nails pressed deep into the soft fabric. When the clock struck 8, the grand doors to the hall swung open. Victor Hale entered, tall and imposing in a perfectly tailored gray suit. The morning light caught his face, sharpening every cold, defined feature. He walked slowly, deliberately, the echo of his leather shoes against the marble floor landing like unspoken commands, forcing everyone to straighten their posture. His eyes swept across each face, lingering just long enough to make them look away, heads bowing to avoid his gaze. The air was thick, heavy with tension, as if it might shatter at any second. "Everyone, gather now." Victor's voice wasn't loud, but it carried an authority that sent staff rushing to form a circle around him. Gareth Cole stepped forward too, his expression full of smug satisfaction, as though he was about to witness a long-awaited punishment. Lydia stood at the edge of the circle, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. Her heart raced faster than ever, fear tightening her chest like a vice. Eli's face flashed in her mind, his bright smile from the night before when she promised she would come home early. She didn't know if, after today, she would still have this job to keep that promise. Victor stood in the center, his sharp gaze sweeping over everyone once more before suddenly stopping on Lydia. He said nothing for several long seconds, letting the tension climb to its breaking point. The entire hall was silent, the ticking of the clock loud and clear in the stillness. Finally, Victor spoke, his deep, even voice landing like hammer blows against the marble floor. "Today there are things that need to be fixed, and the first person I want to talk about." He paused, his piercing gray eyes locking onto Lydia as if pinning her in place. Gareth, standing nearby, smiled with satisfaction, certain this moment would end with Lydia's dismissal in front of everyone. Lydia swallowed hard, her shoulders trembling slightly, but she lifted her head, even as her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Is you, Lydia Moore?" Victor's voice was clear and cold, and for a heartbeat, all of Eden Hall seemed to hold its breath. The entire hall of Eden Hall fell into complete silence, no one daring to breathe too loudly. Every pair of eyes was fixed on Victor Hale and Lydia Moore. Gareth Cole stood nearby, arms crossed, a smug smirk curling on his lips, certain that within seconds Lydia would be humiliated in front of the entire staff. Lydia took a deep breath, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might tear through her chest. Her hands clenched tightly in front of her apron, fingers cold as ice, yet she forced herself to stand tall, even though her legs trembled beneath her. Victor walked slowly toward Lydia, each step cutting into the tense atmosphere like a blade. He stopped right in front of her, close enough for Lydia to hear his slow, steady breathing. He stared at her, his deep gray eyes betraying no emotion, then spoke suddenly, his voice low and clear. "You will no longer work here as a waitress." A wave of murmurs swept through the hall, and Gareth almost allowed himself a full smile, but it froze halfway as Victor's next words shattered his expectation. "Because starting today," Victor continued, his tone sharp as steel, "you will take on the role of Eden Hall's new floor supervisor." The hall erupted in shock. Whispers rose all around, growing louder with disbelief. Gareth stood frozen, his expression stunned, his lips pressed tightly together as if glued shut. Lydia's eyes widened, her voice trembling in disbelief as she whispered, "Me a supervisor?" Victor looked directly at her, and for the first time his tone softened slightly. He removed the thin-framed glasses resting on his face, revealing his sharp gray eyes now less cold than before. "I am the owner of Eden Hall," Victor declared, each word ringing through the hall like a drumbeat. Another wave of astonishment swept across the staff, mouths falling open in shock. He continued, his tone calmer now, but every word striking like an arrow aimed at those who had stood by and done nothing. "I came here to see everything with my own eyes. I needed to know who among you works just for a paycheck and who works with heart. Lydia Moore, you were humiliated, isolated, yet you kept working with patience and dedication. You didn't just do your job. You protected the honor of Eden Hall, even when no one else cared. Lydia stood frozen, her eyes beginning to glisten with tears. She bit her lip, trying to hold them back, but Victor's words stirred emotions she couldn't contain. He held her gaze a moment longer, then gave a small nod. You've passed the hardest test, and you deserve to be recognized. In the corner of the hall, Gareth clenched his fists, his face flushing with anger, but he stayed silent. A few staff members lowered their heads, avoiding Victor's gaze, as if afraid to be called out next. Finally, Lydia could no longer hold back. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but this time it was not from humiliation. It was from relief and gratitude so overwhelming she could hardly describe it. In that moment, for the first time in months, she felt seen, truly seen. The first morning of a new chapter, sunlight reflected off the brand new gleaming sign of the newly opened Eden Hall branch. The spotless glass doors mirrored Lydia Moore's figure in a perfectly tailored black manager's uniform, her hand gripping tightly around a set of silver keys freshly handed to her. The calluses on her wrist still bore traces of the long, grueling months of hard work, but her posture now was different, straight, confident, and full of pride. Beside her, Eli, dressed in a neat little shirt, held his mother's hand tightly, his wide eyes filled with awe as he took in the dazzling scene. "Is this your restaurant, Mommy?" he asked, his voice brimming with wonder. Lydia crouched down, smiling, her gaze soft in a way it hadn't been for months of hardship. "Yes, sweetheart, this is my place, and it will be your place too whenever I work here." Eli let out a cheerful squeal, wrapping his arms around her legs, his innocent face glowing with pride. The automatic glass doors slid open, revealing the hall inside bathed in warm, golden light. The brand new tables, crisp white tablecloths, and perfectly aligned polished silverware all seemed to be waiting for the perfect beginning. New staff and a few returning employees stood in line, some glancing at Lydia with a hint of lingering awkwardness. Not long ago, many of them had looked down on her, but now their expressions had changed. The contempt was gone, replaced with respect. Victor Hale entered, his familiar, composed stride drawing every eye. He was not in his usual dark suit, but instead wore a simple gray coat, though his presence remained as commanding as ever. He stopped just a few steps from Lydia, his once cold gray eyes now softer, holding something almost like trust. He handed her the remaining set of silver keys, his voice deep and steady, but no longer distant. "From now on, you will be responsible for opening this place every morning and for keeping it as if it were your own life, because you have proven that you deserve it." Lydia took the keys, her hand tightening around the cool metal. She looked up at Victor, her lips trembling slightly, but her gaze steady. "Thank you for trusting me," she said. Victor gave a slight nod, the corner of his lips lifting into a small curve, not the mocking smile of before, but a genuine acknowledgement. Eli looked up at Victor, his brown eyes sparkling with innocent curiosity. Victor glanced down, and for a brief moment, a rare gentleness flickered in his eyes as he met the boy's clear gaze. Placing a firm hand on Lydia's shoulder, he gave it a light squeeze and said in a calm, certain tone, "I believe you will do even better than I expect." In that moment, standing in the spacious hall of the new Eden Hall, Lydia's heart raced not with fear, but with hope. For the first time in her life, she felt she truly belonged here, not just as an employee, but as someone who would help shape its future. That morning, the sky was unusually clear, and sunlight stretched across the large glass windows of the newly opened Eden Hall. Lydia Moore stood at the entrance, her hands still holding tightly onto Eli's. Together, they gazed into the spacious hall, where crystal lights reflected off gleaming tables, everything radiating freshness and vitality. But in Lydia's eyes, this wasn't just a luxurious restaurant, it was a beginning, a testament to the months of hardship she had endured with unwavering strength. Eli looked up at his mother, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "Are you ready, Mom?" Lydia bent down, smiling gently as her hand brushed through his soft hair. "I'm ready, sweetheart. This time, We won't have to be afraid anymore." The boy giggled, then suddenly threw his arms around her, his small voice whispering, "I'm proud of you, Mom." Those words pierced through the walls Lydia had built to contain her emotions. Tears slipped down her cheeks, no longer tears of pain or humiliation, but tears of quiet, profound happiness. A short distance away, Victor Hale stood silently, his hands tucked into the pockets of his gray coat. He didn't step inside, nor did he call out to them. His deep gray eyes followed the mother and son, but it was no longer the gaze of a cold employer testing an employee. Instead, it was the look of a man quietly acknowledging something far greater, the strength of an ordinary woman who refused to bow to life's harshness. Victor stayed there for a long moment, letting the morning light wash over his sharp features. He tilted his head slightly, the corner of his lips lifting into a faint smile, a smile no one would have ever imagined him giving to an employee. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, his steps slow but steady, as if he had finally found what he had always been searching for, someone who held on to kindness even in the most brutal of times. Inside, Lydia pushed open the glass door and led Eli in. The cheerful voices of the new staff filled the air, glasses clinked lightly together, and in that moment, she no longer felt like an outsider. Lydia took a deep breath, her eyes sweeping across the space entrusted to her, then turned to Eli, her voice firm and certain. "From today, everything will change. This isn't just a workplace, Eli. This is where we start a new life." The boy's smile widened, his hand gripping his mother's even tighter. Lydia stood in the vast hall, her heart light yet full of hope. For the first time in many years, she felt she truly belonged, not because of her new position, not because of the recognition in others' eyes, but because she had proven something to herself. No matter how harsh life becomes, kindness and perseverance will always have value. Sunlight streamed through the glass windows, illuminating Lydia's bright smile. She knew the road ahead would still be long, but this time she wouldn't be walking it alone. And somewhere out there, perhaps Victor understood too. Sometimes the greatest strength doesn't come from power or wealth, but from a heart that refuses to give up, even when no one is watching. In a world full of competition and prejudice, true strength does not lie in power or status, but in the ability to hold on to kindness even when no one is watching. Lydia's story proves that resilience and compassion will always have value, and sometimes it is those small acts that can change an entire life. If you also believe that kindness is never wasted, hit like and subscribe to help spread meaningful stories like this one. And leave a comment with just 3 words: "I believe," because sometimes even a small belief is enough to give someone else the strength to keep going.